Today we will be presenting the differences and similarities of Australia and France's economy. We will be discussing their economic system, economic problems, inputs and exports, as well as other important topics about their economies.
So to answer our question on which country has a better economy, we will be comparing the basic economies of Australia and France over the past 5 years. We included basic inputs, labor force, and natural resources. We also analyzed GDP, unemployment, and inflation, and we found that Australia's employment decreased by 0.5%, and in France there was an increase in employment by 65.7%. However, there is more to our research.
Both Australia and France have what is referred to as a mixed economic system, which is a mixture between a command economy and a market economy. This allows the government of both countries to make economic decisions to influence on the economy. This also means that consumers and firms participate in making economic decisions. For their tax systems, both Australia and France will have what's called progressive tax, which is an individual level of a tax whose average tax rate increases as taxpayers' income increases. For economic freedom, Australia is actually classified as being a free economic country, being placed as number 3 in the world according to Heritage, while France is considered to be moderately free. In terms of role of government, Australia has a federal parliament democracy, and France has a semi-presidential republic.
In this slide, we're going to be talking about the major economic problems that both countries have. The biggest threat to the Australians and France economy is the COVID-19 pandemic. To Australia, the pandemic threatens to shut down significant sectors of the economy, such as tourism and the service industry. In other hands, in France, the virus has most impacted the production sectors. The impact is due to reduced international demand of majority of its products, such as the lack of the raw materials has also crippled the country production industry. Both countries have come with a resolution for both economic problems. In Australia, the government is up to continue offering billions of indirect economic supports. In France, the government in 2020 unveiled 100 million euros for the economy. Now we're going to talk about the basic inputs for both countries. In Australia, as of March of 2020, the unemployment rate stood at 5.2%, but however, on April it has increased to a 6.2%, raising the number of unemployment persons to 823,300. The country's population comprised approximately of 2,809,973 persons. About 12.79 million are females, with the remaining 12.6% being male. In France, on the other hand, as the third quarter of 2020, the employment rates in France stood at 65.3%, increasing to a 64.6% in the third quarter. France boasts of a population of 67.9 million citizens. Out of that, 31.2% are male and 33.2% are women.
Exports and imports are especially important aspects of helping national economies grow and bridge out. Australia, for example, as of 2018, their biggest exports were coal-bridged iron ore, petroleum gases, gold, aluminum oxide, and for Australia's major imports, it would be petroleum, cars, crude petroleum, delivery trucks, and broadcasting equipment. But France, on the other hand, has a little bit different. France's major exports in 2018 would be planes, helicopters / spacecrafts, cars, packaged medication, vehicle parts, and gas turbines. And for their imports in 2018, it would be cars, crude petroleum, refined petroleum, petroleum gas, and vehicle parts.
The monetary system of France and Australia. France's currency unit is euro. The euro value was higher than the US dollar, but by 2001 it lost most of its value. The banking system went from commercial banks and merchant banks and grouped them as a single supervisory system. France's financial market is run by Autorité des Marchés, AMF. They make sure the market maintains order. Australia's currency unit is Australian dollars, AUD. The Reserve Bank of Australia is Australia's central bank. It set the country's monetary policy and manages the Australian dollar. Australia's bank don't have the same restrictions and limits as the U.S. bank. Their banks are allowed to enter the financial market and can now offer a wide range of financial services.
Now we're going to talk about the gross domestic product of both countries. So these four graphs show the percentage of the GDP and each of its four components: net exports, investment, household consumption, and government expenditures. So first we're going to start with the biggest for both countries, which is household consumption. As we can see, Australia is in blue and France is in orange on the graph. Australia has a much higher household consumption, but it is trending downwards. In the 5-year span from 2015 to 2017, it has started at 58%, almost 60% of its total GDP, and is trending downward to 55%. In comparison, France has stayed around 54%. The next biggest part for both countries is investment. However, this is kind of interesting because this is the one part where we see the trend in the two graphs flip. So Australia and France have stayed pretty consistently similar in terms of investment as a percentage of their GDP, but Australia has trended downwards 3 whole percentage points, whereas France has increased 2 percentage points, and so now they are going to surpass Australia. Government expenditures for both countries has stayed about the same. The main difference here is that France has a much higher government expenditure than Australia. And then for net exports, again, pretty close, but France is started out higher, around this 30% mark. The interesting thing is that Australia has increased their net exports over this 5-year span, and they are due to surpass France in the next coming years, which is interesting considering the net export of France is airplanes, and their biggest producer is Airbus, which is a French company. Now we're going to see how all four of these relate to the economic growth of both countries.
So the rate of economic growth can be measured by GDP. And GDP is similar in both countries in the way that they neither steadily rise or steadily fall. Australia and France's GDP as of 2019 has not yet risen. This might be because of a no change in government expenditures, a rise in unemployment, probable decrease in investment, and increased household consumption. If GDP hasn't risen since 2019, that means that there hasn't been much economic growth since then. GDP per capita is also, as of 2019, still falling. This might be because of a result of distorted information by the population, and it could also be a result of less output put out in the population. A low or falling GDP per capita tells that the country is struggling to give and supply the population with what they need. So both France and Australia are struggling to give the population what they need, which means there hasn't been economic growth since 2019 in neither country. So for Australia and France's unemployment, they've both been decreasing from 2015 till 2019. Australia's inflation, however, it's been increasing since 2016. And France's inflation, it has been increasing since 2015 drastically and has now started to slowly decrease since 2018 to 2019.
To end things off, after researching the differences in Australia and France's economies and analyzing their differences in GDP, unemployment, inflation, exports and imports, and economic problems, all group members were able to agree on that Australia has a better economy and is therefore the best country to live out of the two. Australia has a faster growing economy than France overall, and it's also important to take notice that Australia has a lower unemployment rate than compared to France. Not to mention, Australia is also more economically free.